Right, let's take you back now to the South African Council of Churches National Anti-Corruption Conference. That's where former Chief Justice Raymond Zondo is delivering the keynote address. Let's listen in.
That such a president is not removed. We know what happened last time when that happens, And as we look at what concerns the church leaders in this conference, one of the issues we've got to look at is, and this is part of what the Speaker's brief says, what is it that needs to be done to make sure that our fight against corruption is effective? And that requires learning from the lessons of the past. Nothing has been done to make sure that if we were to have the same situation, a president who has serious allegations of corruption against him or her, and attempts are being made to remove him or her through a constitutional process, that would, what happened previously would not happen. Therefore, the voice of civil society, the voice of the church, becomes critically important, because the stronger that voice is, the more difficult it will become for a majority party or parties who jointly command a majority to ensure that such a president continues despite serious allegations and evidence of corruption. We cannot talk about intensifying or strengthening our fight against corruption or making sure that our fight against corruption is effective without a police force that is able to do its job properly. But before I talk about that, I go back a few years, maybe not a few years. In the early 2000s, we had the Scorpions, which were very effective in fighting corruption. The criminals had begun to fear them. But in the 2007 ANC elective conference, a resolution was taken to disband them. And they were disbanded. The results are there for all of us to see what happened about the levels of corruption. Because I don't believe that the hawks, which were said to have taken their place, are up to that job. In the Commission's report, we referred to a number of complaints or cases that were lodged with the Hawks in 2017 by the board of PRASA that was chaired by Mr. Popo Molefe. We all know that corruption at PRASA has been there for ages and nothing really effective is being done. This board had gone to the Hawks and reported these criminal activities, and there were statements given. At the time of preparing the report of the Commission in early 2022, which was about 5 years later, there was still nobody who had been arrested. And the Hawks said they were still investigating. We called upon the head of the Hawks at the time to explain why there was such a delay. And the report, if you read it, says that his explanation was completely inadequate. As far as I know, in 2025, we have heard of no arrests of those people who were involved in corruption at PRASA, whose cases were laid with the Hawks in 2017. So my faith in the Hawks is not the same as the faith I had in the Scorpions. The question that should arise at a conference like this is for us to ask ourselves whether, when the call was made for the disbandment of the scorpions, we as society did enough to try and protest and say no, this should not happen. I don't believe we did enough. And I say all of us, I don't think we did enough. But that's part of the reason why this conference is so important, because we want to make sure that in the future we don't make the kinds of mistakes that we have made, where we have not raised our voice to the heavens and certain things have happened and completely weakened our fight against corruption. There are proposals for an anti-corruption agency, and the proposal is that it should be a Chapter 9 institution in order to avoid exactly what happened to scorpions. There are some who are opposed to it, and I don't know why they are opposed to it, because it should be so clear and so welcome that what happened to the scorpions should never happen again. So I believe that we should never look at who comes up with a proposal. If the proposal is good, it doesn't matter who it comes from, we should support it. And the church must lead the way, because some in society will not support a good proposal just because it comes from Mr. Dlamini or Mrs. Mkhize, but they will only support it if it comes from someone else. The church must teach all of us in society that that is not the way to do. Equally important in the fight against corruption is the NPA. In recent times, there have been frustrations on the part of society because of some cases that the NPA has not handled in a manner that satisfies society. And these have largely been matters which relate to high-profile personalities and are corruption matters. The NPA is critically important in the fight against corruption. We cannot afford to have a weak NPA. We cannot afford to have a weak NPA that cannot do its job. The NPA needs to be given all the resources that it can have in order to play its role in the fight against corruption. But also, it is important that people at the NPA throughout the country, the prosecutors, be people of integrity. When they decide that they are charging somebody with corruption, we must know that it has got nothing to do with anything except breach of the law. When they say they are withdrawing charges, we must know that it is because in good faith they believe they should be withdrawn. But in recent times we have had the NPA bring forward, have people arrested, usually very publicly, and brought to court, and we believe that they have decided there are good grounds to charge those people. But after some time they withdraw the charges. And we are not told why. And that does not help them. That does not help us to have confidence in the NPA, because we are not going to know if the withdrawal of charges has something to do with corruption. So the NPA, I would think, needs to reconsider its policy of not sharing its reasons with the public when it withdraws charges from people, especially on corruption matters. Because if it shares its reasons, it's going to help to ensure that society has confidence in them. The courts. No fight against corruption can be complete without the courts, the judiciary. We need a judiciary that is independent, that is strong, that is competent, that is fearless, and that is not prejudiced against anybody. That sticks to the oath of office that all judicial officers take to administer justice without fear, favor, or prejudice. I have no hesitation in saying most members of the judiciary are people of integrity, and that they've got personal independence, which enables them to make decisions according to how they understand the law and the evidence, and not to favor anybody or not on the basis of any prejudice against anybody. We do have personal independence. All of you would be aware of cases where the judiciary has taken decisions that are unpopular, but it has taken them because that's in line with their oath of office and that shows integrity. But the judiciary cannot play its rightful role in the fight against corruption effectively if it doesn't have enough resources. The courts in Gauteng have been suffering from lack of enough judges and resources, with the result that it takes years in order for litigants in the Gauteng division of the High Court to get a date for their trials, whether it's criminal or civil. The church, I believe, should, among other things, support the judiciary. It should support the judiciary's call for what we call institutional independence of the judiciary. That is, in short, the independence of the judiciary to control its own budget and its own resources, and to appoint its own personnel without the involvement of the executive, which happens at the moment. In this regard, I was happy with the announcement of the President recently that the judiciary will be given its full or complete institutional independence, because we have been fighting for this for a long time. The previous Chief Justices fought for it. I played my role to fight for it. But the executive has been dragging its heels in order to give it. And yet we ask for nothing more than what the other arms of the state, the executive branch of government, the legislative branch of government have. All we say is, let us also have the same power to control our operations. And in that way, society is able to confront us when we do not do well. And we will not have the excuse of saying it's somebody else sitting in Pretoria or Cape Town who has not made certain decisions that need to be made. Without an independent judiciary, including institutional independence, our fight against corruption is weakened. So I believe that the church must be heard. Its voice in that regard must be strong. There is one area in relation to the judiciary which provides, in my view, a door, opens a door for the capture of the judiciary, which needs to be addressed. In terms of Section 178 of the Constitution, the appointment of judges, the appointment of the JSC, which interviews judges and in a number of ways effectively appoints them, gives the president of the country and the majority party, in a situation where there is a majority party in parliament, too much power. For all these 30 years, it would have been possible for the president of the country and the majority party effectively to appoint 12 members of the JSC, and 12 members of the JSC is the majority required when the JSC sits to interview judges for the Supreme Court of Appeal and the Constitutional Court. Therefore, because of that, it means the president and the majority party can come together and decide which candidates will go through. The president has power to appoint 4 persons after consultation with leaders of political parties in the National Assembly. It says after consultation. That means he doesn't have to agree with them. They can express their views, but ultimately he appoints. It doesn't say in consultation, which would be he would need their agreement. But apart from that, the Constitution in Section 178 also provides for the National Assembly or the NCOP to designate 4 of its permanent delegates. So if the majority party, if there is a majority party, that could easily be those coming from the majority party. So that means 4 from the president and 4 from the NCOP, that's 8. And then in terms of Section 178, the National Assembly is given 6 members to designate to the JSC, 3 of whom, at least, should come from opposition parties. But that means 3 can come from the majority party. And that then gives us 11. And then you have the Minister of Justice, who is appointed by the president without him having to agree with anybody. So that 12, I'm leaving out the Chief Justice and the President of the Supreme Court of Appeal, who also are appointed by the President without him having to agree with anybody. So the JSC can actually be controlled by the majority party when there's a majority party. But even when there is no majority party, if 2 or more parties come together to form majority, they can control and make sure that ultimately the people who are at the JSC will vote in a certain way to make sure that certain candidates succeed. And then, if this is not addressed, and it would, of course, unfortunately require a constitutional amendment, then this door remains open for the capture of the judiciary. We should never allow that. We are lucky that over the 30 years when this constitutional provision was there, this did not happen. But it can happen anytime. And we should never want a situation where, when it happens, we look back and say, we knew this door was open, but we did not close it. So the church must raise its voice strong and clearly. And there is no reason why a body that appoints judges should have as few judges as the JSC has. When the JSC sits as 23, when it considers appointments to the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal, there are only 3 judges out of a body of 23. It's the Chief Justice, the President of the SCA, and it's a Judge President designated by the Judges President only. And yet it is there in the space of the judiciary to appoint the judiciary. It should have more judges. And I think we must also relook at making sure that some of the members of the JSC should be judges. The 4 persons, for example, that the Constitution says the President may appoint after consulting leaders of political parties who don't have to be members of the National Assembly and SOP, there is no reason why those should not be judges. Retired judges, for example, who can be put in there. There is no reason why we should at least have at least about 10 judges in a body of 23. The judges don't get involved when the legislature and the executive appoint people. But when they need to have appointments, not only does the legislature and the executive get involved, but the judges are in the minority. A strong judiciary needs to make sure that it is properly represented in the JSC. Lastly, before I stop, and I suspect that my time is finished, no fight against corruption in this country is going to succeed without a strong protection of whistleblowers. But not only that, in the report of the Commission, as some of you will know, we have called for the incentivization of whistleblowing, by which we mean if a whistleblower has given information that has enabled the state to recover money that was lost to corruption, the whistleblower should get a percentage of that. Now, we have had whistleblowers who have lost jobs because of blowing the whistle. We have had whistleblowers who have had criminal charges brought against them, civil claims brought against them, who have had their homes taken away from them because they can no longer pay for the bond, who have had to take out their children from the schools they previously chose when they had money and put them in other schools because they have nothing. We have to protect them. But there is no reason why we can't do that. Some, of course, say reporting crime is a civic duty that everyone should do, and nobody should be paid for doing that. My answer is simple. In a normal society where the levels of corruption are low, maybe we can have that luxury. I think the levels of corruption that we have in this country do not allow us to have that luxury. At any rate, this proposal is not something that is completely unheard of in legislation in South Africa. There is legislation where Parliament has said if, as a result of evidence given in a court by a particular witness which has resulted in the conviction of an accused, the minister relevant to that legislation must ensure that about a quarter of the fine imposed goes to that person. So there is legislation which already recognizes that under certain circumstances it is permissible to pay people who help us catch criminals. If it is acceptable in those situations, why can it not be acceptable when we fight the scourge of corruption? I believe the voice of the church in this regard would be very strong. lastly, appointments, suspensions, and dismissals. In South Africa, we have a situation where, particularly in government, people who have allegations of wrongdoing and corruption are appointed to public office. In this regard, you will all remember that a few years ago, the president appointed a certain minister as a cabinet minister in circumstances where in the media there was a story about allegations of her qualification from a certain university. And when the question was raised, but how can the president appoint such a person while those allegations are hanging over her head? The response was, we will wait for the investigations of the law enforcement agencies. I'm afraid that's not the answer that should be given by an ethical leader. There are many people who have no allegations of fraud or corruption hanging over their heads who qualify to be ministers, even in the same party. There is no reason why, for public office, somebody should be appointed before they clear themselves of such allegations. But also there are people in public service who are allowed to continue with their work as usual, even when there are findings of wrongdoing against them. And the state simply allows them to continue. That is not the kind of ethical leadership that we need if we are going to fight corruption. We need the church in this regard to be bold and come out strongly and say there is one rule. This is not acceptable. It weakens our fight against corruption, and it must stop, and it must stop now. I hope that in the course of this address, we have been able to pick up some of the lessons we should pick up for our fight against corruption as it continues. And I hope that you have picked up some of the dangers that we should be aware to. Let's close the doors where the capture of the judiciary would come in. Thank you very much.
So you've just listened there to former Chief Justice Raymond Zondo giving the keynote address at the South African Council of Churches National Anti-Corruption Conference, which is currently underway in Johannesburg. It's a sitting that's going to last, by the way, for 2 days. And Raymond Zondo has really touched on a wide range of issues as he tries to outline what ought to be done to finally claw back on staggering levels of corruption in this country. He's spoken once again about the institutional independence of the judiciary, saying he's done his part as Chief Justice when he was still in that chair, and has now accused the executive of dragging their feet in finally pushing this over the line. He says no fight against corruption in this country will be worth it without the protection of whistleblowers. He's once again repeated the recommendation he's made as the chair of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry for whistleblowers to be incentivized to speak out, given what's at stake. And in case you missed it, the suggestion at least is that whistleblowers in the country should be given a cut of the money that South Africa is able to recover as a result of them blowing the whistle. And Raymond Zondo has justified this by saying in many instances these individuals are targeted and they lose out in their own lives through speaking out. So their houses, for example, in instances are lost, jobs are lost. He's also made an example of a whistleblower who's had to take their child out of a particular school because they can no longer afford to send them to that institution, at least now that they don't have money. Raymond Zondo also really lamenting how some municipalities have responded to reports from the Auditor General. Takane Maluleke, I beg your pardon, is also in that room, by the way. She's likely to speak at some stage to give her own input around what it will take to finally shift the needle insofar as the fight against corruption is concerned. There's no overstating, by the way, the work of the church, just even when you track the history of South Africa. We certainly are in a society where a lot of people do take their cues from these institutions, and I suppose it's from that lens that the story becomes noteworthy at the very least, especially in a context where we're desperate for solutions on how to push back against widespread corruption in the country. We'll keep listening to that conference for you, of course, throughout the course of the day.